Maine.
And I am recording, as you've just heard. And we are continuing our study of the book of Job. Last time we had an introduction that I prepared, and we began with the first chapter. And in the first chapter of the book of Job, basically we hear the story of Job and his family, and they are fine, upstanding folks. We don't know that they're Jewish. There's no genealogy. We're not told what tribe Job is from. So, and again, many people think this story is really an allegory or a myth. I'm not sure the word allegory fits, but a myth meant to teach a lesson. But we know that Job doesn't sin and goes out of his way to even, cover what might be inadvertent sins of his children. And apparently God is bragging to Satan about this, Hasatan, I should say. And he says something to the effect that, what do you think of where have you been? And well, we'll see. Actually, I'm going to start my screen share because interestingly, chapter 2 starts out virtually identically with chapter 1. Yeah, I'll just go through this this slide myself. One day the divine beings presented themselves before the Lord. The adversary came along with them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to the adversary, "Where have you been?" The adversary answered the Lord, "I've been roaming all over the earth." And so, as I point out, this is almost identical to the language we see in chapter 1. We don't know how long after chapter 1 this has taken place. We do know that in chapter 1, Job is afflicted with all kinds of disease, and still Job does not curse God, saying very famously, Adonai Natan v'Adonai lakach, Yehi Shem Adonai mevarach. God has given, God has taken away. Blessed be the name of God. Bryce.
Should I infer anything from the language that says one day the divine beings presented themselves before the Lord? The adversary came along with them. Do I infer from that the adversary is not a divine being?
No, well, I don't know what you infer, but my understanding of the setting is the adversary is one of these creatures that hang out in the heavens. The divine beings are B'nai HaElohim, and God is here in the first two chapters is generally referred to as Yod He Vav He. So I think the simplest reading of this is simply that Hasatan is one of these divine beings that can go back and forth to various places. They're not called angels here, but I wouldn't read more into it. I mean, that would be my understanding. Jim.
Yeah, the New American Bible I have, here it says one day. This says once again.
Yes.
And one other thing, the divine beings, here it says sons of God.
Yes. So this is, I would say a translator's attempt to be more fluid, because the language in chapter 2 verse 1 is exactly the same as chapter 1 verse 6. So it says Vayihi Hayom, and it was on a day, or the day, Yava'u, they came, the B'nai HaElohim. So literally sons of God. That's not a bad translation. The question is, what in the world do we mean by sons of God? The Hit Yatsev al Adonai. So the translator, and in my old JPS translation in this book also said, again it fell upon a day that the sons of God came to present themselves. So it's one of the things that we talk about a lot, and Dr. Schals and I talk about endlessly our issues of translations and what do we read into these translations. But yeah, I don't disagree that that's what your translation reads. And I can't remember if I read verse 2, but it's virtually identical. He says to Hasatan, what have you been up to? And he says, I've been roaming over the earth. Okay, so I'm going to read again the same thing that we see almost in chapter 1. And Adonai said to the adversary, have you noticed my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. He keeps his integrity. Now something new. So you have incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason. So this is kind of interesting. I just love playing with the highlighting and the boxes floating, and I admit it, it's so much fun. So he says, God seems to be blaming Hasatan here for basically inflicting Job with all of these diseases. And so I'll just read one more verse. The adversary answered the Lord, skin for skin, all that a man will give up for his life. So and the commentary in Sepharia is apparently a proverb whose meaning is uncertain. This is actually a pretty good literal translation. Or ba'ed or, skin for skin, or as a witness for sin, or something for skin. So basically, as we'll see, what the thrust of this comment will be is, sure, Job hasn't cursed you, God, but that's because you haven't really affected him personally. You've only affected his children and his livestock and his riches and everything else, but you haven't really affected him. Okay, so now I will ask if someone would like to read.
Well, I'll read if no one wants to read.
Okay.
But lay a hand on his bones and his flesh, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face. So the Lord said to the adversary, see, he is in your power, only spare his life. The adversary departed from the presence of the Lord and inflicted a severe inflammation on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head.
And I think I have some things. Yeah, and I'll just point out, I'm not going to point this out every time, but the same euphemism for blaspheme is bless. Yivarechecha. And he has some kind of a shechin. Anybody recognize the word shechin?
As in Shekinah?
No, not Shekinah.
Shekinah?
No, yeah, you both. I should check the spelling of Shekinah, but or Shachon, but that's not. Let me put it this way: think Passover. Shechin. Anybody recognize? It's one of the plagues. Remember that? Shechin, and it's typically translated as boils. And we don't know. Clearly, we don't know what kind of affliction Job was afflicted with. It's been explained as boils, elephantitis, black leprosy. I have no idea what black leprosy is. I got this out of one of my sources. I looked for images, even cartoon images, and they were all too upsetting for me to bring before your faces, an hour after dinner. So, or just before bedtime, depending on your time zone. So I restrained myself. Bryce, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so the previous reading of the interaction between the Lord and the adversary really makes the Lord look like kind of a rube, and that the adversary is completely manipulating him. And it's really, I wonder about that, because that seems a little odd.
Right. So what I would say is, the way I would read this is that the authors of this text are nervous about God doing such an awful thing. So they have God blaming Satan, which, I find is Satan a separate force with his own mind? I mean, I think we talked about this in the introduction last time. Satan in the Bible doesn't really resemble Satan in Christianity, but I will hasten to add that as during Talmudic times and mystical representations of Hasatan sounds very much like Satan of Christianity and Satan in the Quran. And I think this is an influence of Zoroastrian thought, where you have, gods of light and gods of darkness. We see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we have kind of two opposing forces. And so Satan starts to grow into that role in later texts, not so much in this text. But I just think, my sense here is I agree with you, Bryce, and that the author of the text is already itching to get God off the hook and blame
Yeah, if you go to the
Satan.
next page, but the thing is, he gets God off the hook, but that's because he's being outmaneuvered by Hasatan, saying, "Oh, but if you did these horrible, yeah, but that's not much. I mean, if you do these other horrible things to him, then he's going to do it to you." And he's going, "Oh, you think so? Yeah, well, okay, well, let's give it a shot."
So again, we have lots of places in the Bible where God seems to put people to the test, and the most obvious and most troubling one is the near sacrifice of Isaac. So that's very troubling.
The one he's putting to the test here is the adversary, because
Well,
he's letting the
basically,
adversary get away with murder here.
Well, not murder, everything short of.
Yes.
But
Well, he kills the whole family.
But basically, what I think is going on here is God is putting God with the influence of Hasatan is putting Job to the test. The question is whether Job will be faithful to God in spite of horrible things unjustly happening to him. God says yes, Hasatan says no, and so we have the enactment of the test. And Henry, I see you waving.
Yes.
I don't know what that
image.
Yeah, but
some reason it's going funny on me. But
okay.
Anyway, I'm thinking Satan is more like a prosecuting attorney.
Well, that's always the definition given, and we see the translation here of an adversary. Yeah.
Right.
So you might expect Job to say witch hunt. It's a witch hunt, but it doesn't go there. I'm not sure what the Hebrew for witch hunt would be, but clearly the opening two chapters, what I'm calling the fable, is setting up a simplistic test and a very troubling test, and it's only a few chapters out of what is a very different book, the poem, what the scholars and what we will call the poem in between the opening and closing chapters. Okay, I put it in, I'm sorry, there it is. And here's Job's three friends that are going to come, and Job's wife talking to Job. I thought I didn't put it in. Okay, so why don't you continue, Joanne?
All right. He took a potsherd to scratch himself as he sat in ashes. His wife said to him, "You shall keep your integrity, blaspheme God, and die." But he said to her, "You talk as any shameless woman might talk. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? For all that, Job said nothing sinful."
Okay. And some suggest that because Job had leprosy, he had to sit outside the city on the ash heap of burned animal dung, or, people talk about he may have been sitting in ashes, having mourned the death of his family. So her view is actually exactly the same as Hasatan's. Basically, Satan believes that Job will curse God or blaspheme God, and of course the word is bless, berech. And so she thinks that's what he should do as well. And Job describes her as shameless or foolish. I'm just curious about at least one other translation I have here. Impious in this translation, but Nevel can be foolish. And I can't remember. Yeah, so he has a very, I think, an important theological insight, which is, should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? So again, the Patience of Job lasts 2 chapters, but here's an example of it, that Job is saying, yeah, should I only accept good stuff from God, and should I not accept the bad stuff from God? And I often, talk about this idea that many of us, when horrible things happen, will say, why me? But generally, when we say, why me, we're reacting to something negative. It's rare to hear someone, calling up with a big donation to the temple's funds saying, why me? What did I do to deserve all this good fortune and wonderful things in my life? Alan.
I want to question the wording about God doing, however you worded that, God doing bad things and good things. Can you restate how you worded that, comparing?
No, I can't restate it. I'm not sure what I said.
Well,
if you're listening to this on the video, you can go back a minute or two.
Okay, then let me go to where I was reacting to it. I'll do it my way, which is, to me, this is not about God. This is about people, in the way that we are created in the image of God, which includes the way in which people end up with things that are not very favorable to the people, but it still deserves to be attributed to our creation of God. So it gives me a context that both of those things are going to happen, and you can blame God or credit God, but it's built into the concept that I believe.
You're saying it's a statement about human nature, not about the nature of God.
Exactly. That's what you said. Actually, I just didn't remember what you said.
Yeah, and the Hebrew is actually quite simple. Gam et hatov nekabel. Only the good we should receive, me'at ha'elohim, from God, ve'et ha'ra no nekabel, and the evil or ra we shouldn't receive. And of course, Isaiah has a phrase which is repeated in our daily liturgy, which says, God, oseh shalom uvarei et hara. God creates peace and also, I would say, randomness or tragedy. That's Isaiah speaking. So God is the author of it all. Alan, I presume you are done. You can lower your hand. Okay. So, and again, I'll point out, just like at the end of chapter 1, we could end this story here. If the question raised in both chapters 1 and 2 is whether Job will curse God, the answer is no. So we've got the answer. We could be done with the entire book here, if the book was a simplistic book. Bryce.
Yeah, I've noticed that there's a quite understandable emotional emotional bias, and the bias is, and once again understandable, we attribute good things to God's direct intentions, that God intended these things to happen. But when something bad happens, we do everything we can to diffuse it. And instead of God made this bad thing happen, we say, oh, God caused randomness and chaos, or this happened and this happened. So everything we try to do is to try to take God off the hook.
Yeah, so I would say,
I was just going to say, God is the equal author of everything bad and everything good, because it all comes from the same origin, bad and good, all at the same time. And they're all a continuum.
Right. So I would say, if you're theologically honest, you can't do what you just suggested. And that is only attribute good to God and not bad to God. So you have to struggle with the theological concept of theodicy. And the nice thing is, other than chapters 1 and 2, the entire book of Job is struggling with that question of theodicy, and is going to come up with an answer. And, you know, Harold Kushner and I, and all of us struggle with the question of theodicy, and we have to come up with an answer. But to say that God's only involved with the good and not involved with the bad, I think is an perhaps comforting but overly simplistic reading. You know, I'll mention something. I don't know if I've mentioned it in this tour of Job, but very early in my rabbinate, the 16-year-old son of one of the leaders of the synagogue in Camarillo was killed in a car accident. And it was a bunch of kids driving, and they took a turn too quickly, and the car rolled over, and there were more kids than seatbelts in the car. And I don't even know how many kids that could have seatbelts were wearing seatbelts. This young 16-year-old Jewish boy was thrown out of the car and hit the curb and died. No one else in the car was mortally wounded. I mean, I don't know. I never did find out whether anybody was seriously hurt, but only this one boy was killed. And I have no doubt that all of the other parents felt like there was a guardian angel or God was looking out from their kid. And I would never try and convince them otherwise. But if I believe that, then I have to accept the idea that if God really is in charge, then God too was responsible for the death of this young man, and that heavily informs my own theology. But my understanding is that among many thinkers, and I would say fundamentalists in the Jewish world, mystics believe that God is in charge. We may not thoroughly understand the role and the meaning of all of the things that go on, but I would say no one that takes God seriously can avoid taking that question seriously. Alan. You're muted, Alan.
Your story about the young person killed in a car accident, and I had a classmate in the summer right after high school. I went to that with a classmate, but it I think we're handling going down paths that don't make sense to me. In other words, I don't believe that the decisions are made by God in a way that one can blame God or credit God the way that we often do. And I'll use the Holocaust as an example. And so in way in which events happen, some are controlled by people who make terrible, evil decisions, let's say the Holocaust. But an accident where one person gets killed and another person in the same car doesn't, it doesn't develop a meaningful conversation to try to attribute what part of God is in this experience.
Oh, I think it's a very meaningful conversation. I mean,
Really?
it is the conversation that dominates my thinking about God. So, and that's what the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, are all about. So
And
I'm not
the
saying you'll
answer-
necessarily come up with.
The answer is what then? If it's not,
So
if it's-
that's what we're gonna read what the book of Job has to say about it. And you know, at the end we'll discuss it, and you know, we can talk about what mystics have to say about it. We can talk about what rationalists like Harold Kushner and me have to say about it. You know, Bill can chime in and talk about what Christianity has to say about it. But we will absolutely address that.
okay.
Okay, let's continue. We're still in chapter 2, and now we're going to start meeting Job's friends. So, Joanne, you want to continue?
When Job's 3 friends heard about all these calamities that had befallen him, each came from his home. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They met together to go and console and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could not recognize him, and they broke into loud weeping. Each one tore his robe and threw dust into the air on his head.
Yeah, in case you're wondering, Eliphaz is introduced earlier in Genesis as the firstborn son of Esau. Bildad, the Shuhite, is a brother tribe to the Midian tribes, and Zophar's origin is not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. Okay.
They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. None spoke a word to him, for they saw how very great was his suffering.
So this really is the origin of observing Shiva. His 3 friends come. He has just lost close family members, namely his children. And so he sits on the ground. Some of you may know that the tradition of Shiva is to sit low, either sit on the floor, sit on, back in New York, they had special little low chairs with sawed off legs. I always thought it was pretty bizarre. But basically, you're not supposed to be comfortable. And the tradition actually is you don't speak to the person observing Shiva. You sit next to them. You might say a traditional word of consolation, and then you leave to the person the option of whether they want to talk about the person who's just died, whether they want to, talk about funny thing happened in that person's life, sweet memories, or whether they want to talk about the Super Bowl. It's up to the mourner to decide how they want to mourn. Jim.
I think you said that the first 2 chapters, people think that that's a different author than the rest of the book. And I think it was Jerry last week that said that the first 2 chapters were added later on. Does that include this paragraph?
Yes,
Job's
yes.
3 friends?
Yes, because these are written in prose, whereas the middle, what's called the poem, is written in poetry. But yes, this is written, and I don't know, I can't remember reading which one scholars believe is earlier or later, but they seem to be separate. So I don't know if there was a simplistic story into which a complex poem was added, or a complex poem around which a simple story was added.
So the authors change once we start talking about Job's 3 friends?
Once we get into chapter 3.
But not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
And one of the things I learned from reading commentaries on this, and maybe from Harold Kushner, and that is, in the aftermath of tragedy, there's a time for theology and explanation, and there's a time just to sit quietly and be present. This, some of you who know me will know that this is not easy for me, because when I meet someone that's just gone through a tragedy, one of the things that they will routinely say is, how could God allow this to happen? And I have to control myself to realize that this is not really the time to talk about theodicy, in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy. This is a time just to be there and hug and cry and be with someone. In the chaplaincy world, we call it the ministry of presence. We're just there. One of my friends who's a rabbi would say, when someone would complain that, this person came to comfort me and said the stupidest thing to me. And there are many stupid things you can say to someone who has just lost a loved one. They're in a better place. God needed them in the next world. I mean, I think those things are stupid. Forgive me if you don't think those things are stupid. Yeah. And so one of, my colleague, John, no, I can't remember John's last name. John Sherwood of blessed memory would say, when someone says that to you, look down at their feet. And the person asks, well, what do you mean look at their feet? And the answer is, they are there. They are standing there in front of you. They don't know what to say and they're uncomfortable, but at least they're there. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is something I would never do. And that is, I'm going to jump to the very end of the book, and we'll read this again. God knows how many weeks it'll be before we get to chapter 42 of the book. So we've gone from chapter 2 to 42. And so again, this is the fable. We're still in this simplistic fable prose story. This is the happily ever after part of the fable. And then the poem is in between. And there's actually a little bit of theology in here, which I can't resist commenting on. But well, let's see, Joanne, since you're reading the fable, if you'd like to continue right here.
After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am incensed at you and your 2 friends, for you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job.
Okay, let's stop for a second. So basically, as you will see, the three friends and a fourth one who comes along will basically preach Torah. They'll preach Deuteronomy. They'll say to Job, you've clearly undergone this horrible tragedy. You must have done something wrong. Repent from your sins, ask forgiveness, and then God will forgive you. So we are going to have literally 38 chapters of this dialogue. And don't worry, we're not going to read all 38. We're going to read some of it because it's worth at least being exposed to it. But to me, this is a very, this is a very important sentence. Let me just see if yeah. Okay, so why don't you continue with the next paragraph, and then I'll comment.
Now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. And let Job my servant pray for you. For to him I will show favor and not treat you vilely, since you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job.
So this is very important. The friends basically are preaching Torah. They're preaching Deuteronomy. Bad things don't happen to good people. Therefore, you must have sinned. Therefore, repent for your sin, and God will restore things or will forgive you. Job refuses to go along with this because Job knows he hasn't sinned, at least in this context, and God ultimately says, as we see, God is incensed at Job's friends, not at Job. Because you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. Therefore, the friends have to go and submit offerings, or what amount to, I guess, their sin offerings, sacrifice a burnt offering, and olah, and let's see if Job will pray for you. So I think this is a key theological point. We're going to see. We're not going to get a simplistic answer to the question. But we are going to get an answer, and that is the answer is not the simple answer we find in Deuteronomy. And let's finish it up, Joanne.
Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord had told them, and the Lord showed favor to Job. The Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed on behalf of his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice what he had before.
Now, I know we're going to be upset
Wait
just
a
because he has
minute.
twice.
He didn't have 20 children.
He does.
20 children?
We'll see. Okay, let's continue.
All his brothers and sisters and all his former friends came to him and had a meal with him in his house. They consoled and comforted him for all the misfortune that the Lord had brought upon him. Each gave him 1 kesita, a unit of unknown value, and each 1 gold ring. Thus the Lord blessed the latter years of Job's life more than the former. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 she-asses.
Okay, and if we go back to chapter 1, we'll see he has received double.
He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters. The first he named Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Keren Hapuk. Now where in the land were women as beautiful as Job's daughters to be found. Their father gave them estates together with their brothers.
No, you're right, Cheryl. Same number of kids. It is the same number as in chapter 1. It's and it's also interesting that only the daughters are named here. It's noteworthy, in texts that seem to favor the male, more interest in the male line, and only the comment about how beautiful the daughters are is mentioned here.
Afterward, Job lived 140 years to see 4 generations of sons and grandsons. So Job died old and contented.
So Job lives happily ever after. And we have observed, and I agree with you, that getting new kids isn't exactly the same as, as getting doesn't eliminate the pain of having lost your children. But this is a simplistic discussion. Ken and Patricia.
So just curious, because I don't know Hebrew, but in my book, it says that the daughters were named Dove, Cinnamon, and Horn of Eyeshade.
Horn of what?
Eyeshade.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, you
eyeshade.
mean, yes. So here they're transliterating the Hebrew.
Okay,
Let me back so I can see the
so
Hebrew.
that's Dove, and the second
Yeah,
one is
yeah,
Cinnamon?
yeah. So,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, I
Okay.
noticed that in reading it. Yes. So, yeah. So the question is, do you, do you want to call Hadassah or Myrtle?
Nice, cool,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah. Okay. Okay. So, now we are about to go into the poem of Job. Oh, Jim, sorry.
I'm confused.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
My work here is done. Thank you.
Deuteronomy, obviously in the Torah,
Yes.
Jews consider that divinely inspired by God. But here God seems to be saying, you're preaching Deuteronomy, which is in my Torah, and that's wrong.
Yes.
So why would the rabbis put this in the Bible when it's saying the Torah is wrong?
Well, they're not going to make that statement explicitly,
Well,
but
okay, yeah.
but they're making it implicitly. So let me ask, why do you think the book of Job is doing it? Why is this in the Bible? Anybody have any? I certainly have thoughts on this.
I think Dr. Scholl's probably has an idea.
Yes. So, Henry, yeah,
I guess not.
you're
Okay.
muted, Henry. You're muted, Henry.
Yeah, okay. The reality is, bad things happen to good folks. I mean, and
Yes.
so how do we address it? And I think this is one of the ways they address the issue because, I think it's pretty simplistic to say only good things happen if you're doing good stuff, and bad stuff happens if you're doing bad stuff. That's not always the case in reality in the real world. So
Yes.
I think it's nice that we have this and we can kind of confront the issue and discuss it and so on.
Yes, and your question even makes me think one level deeper. If you think about when the rabbis decided to put this book in and these thoughts in, what has happened? They've gone through 2 unsuccessful revolts against Rome, which are equivalent to the Holocaust. A third of the Jews of the world have been murdered during the revolts against Rome. The Jews have been expelled from Jerusalem. The temple is destroyed. The fields around Jerusalem have been salted, so nothing will grow there. So how could you not address that question? And again, I'll just remind you that the word Israel, Yisrael, means one who wrestles with God. So if you want a simplistic Sunday school, happily ever after insight into God, you're coming to the wrong place. It is deep and it's sophisticated and it's even somewhat dark. After Bryce comments, I'm going to make a comment of something I learned a week ago from a brilliant scholar. Bryce.
Yeah, the last comment by Henry about the idea that the rabbis put this in because the implication of Deuteronomy is that if you do all of the things of Deuteronomy, bad things will not happen to you.
Right.
And that bad things do happen to people, even if they try to do all that they can.
Right.
But the thing that's left out of the computation is that these were not just the random chaos of life. This was a deliberate act of God. So one could take the meaning that when bad things happen, God is out to get you.
Yeah, I don't think there's any Jewish tradition that would take that meaning.
Well, what I mean is from the text. In other words,
Yes.
if you take the idea from the text and from the implication, I realize we don't want to, and the tradition is not to.
Right.
But a simplistic reading of it would be that.
And that may be the rabbis sort of hedging their bets and not wanting to basically completely disconnect God from this. I want to mention something, and I only learned it a week or two ago, so I haven't completely mastered it. At the conference I went to in Palm Springs, there was a female rabbi, which is not such a female Orthodox rabbi, which is not such a common thing, and an astoundingly brilliant scholar. And she quoted a midrash. I should dig out this stuff. I'm not really prepared to teach it. She quoted a midrash. So here's the midrash. It says Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, right? And so the midrash goes into an interesting discussion of how could there be night? If God was with Moses on the mountain, shouldn't the light of Shekhinah made it impossible to know whether it's day or night? So that's one kind of interesting thing. But the other thing which was really interesting is she talked about what she called the Torah of the night. And I can see myself writing a parody of music of the night, but it's such a deep concept that I almost can't write a parody about it. But what she says is, during the daytime, God dictated a clear Torah to Moses, the written Torah, the Torah Shebichtav. And at night, when things are not so clear, that's when God dictated the oral law. And the implication, and I don't fully understand this, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. The implication is that God builds into theology a certain level of unclarity and uncertainty. And we're not supposed to necessarily completely understand it. And, if you study Talmud, you realize the rabbis are always digging into these issues and not necessarily coming up with simple answers or simple understandings, and certain things are just left open. And then she used the phrase, which as a physicist kept me up all night. She said it's a theological uncertainty principle. And those of you who know something about physics, there's something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which says a certain amount of uncertainty is built into the structure of the universe. It's not a failure to be able to measure accurately. I don't want to get into the physics of the uncertainty principle, but it's built into the structure. And her point, which I thought was fascinating, is that God builds a certain amount of uncertainty and questioning into the structure of revelation. And I just thought it was a magnificent idea. Alan.
Well, I'd like to get more information because you just read what I was trying to say earlier when I was trying to separate blame from credit in God. This was wonderful. I thank you.
And it wasn't a simple talk, and I'm trying to summarize it simply. Okay, so now we have some time left, so we're going to start talking now about the poem of Job. 39 chapters, 90% of the book, and it's very different than the simplistic happily ever after somewhat troubling fable. The Hebrew is quite poetic and complex. There are more instances of hapex legomenon, a word occurring only once in the Bible than any other book. The LXX, for those who don't, this is not a Super Bowl game. It's the Roman number 70, and it refers to the Septuagint, which was the first Jewish translation into Greek and becomes very important to Christianity. But that translation leaves out several dozen verses, just leaves them out, because we'll see so many examples as you read this text where you'll see a little asterisk or something in the translation, and it'll say meaning of the Hebrew unclear, and meaning of Hebrew uncertain, and notes in the English translation. And then we find hundreds of minor discrepancies between our text and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls are probably written a few hundred years after the book of Job is written. And so again, this is an important mindset for you to keep in mind, is you're a scribe and you're copying a book, right? You're copying a sacred book. So you're being really careful because it's sacred. But now if you see things that are clearly don't make any sense, what do you do? Do you copy it faithfully, leaving, say, typos, misspellings in there? Or do you correct it? Do you make changes? And maybe the changes are actually closer to the original, whatever it was a few hundred years ago. So when you're struggling as a scholar with an ancient text, this is a problem that exists, because at least in the Bible, we have something called the Masoretic text. Around 1,000 years ago, a little over 1,000 years ago, a group called the Masoretes said, this is the text and we're sticking with it, even though there are errors. We'll note some of the errors, but we're not going to change the Hebrew. But when you have other texts like Talmud or Mishnah, you'll find lots of variations. And, I remember being introduced to this idea by Daniel Matt, who was doing the first and probably only good translation of the Zohar. And the first step was to get all of the copies of the Zohar that he could lay his hands on, photographically or otherwise, because there's lots of variations in those texts. And the first thing he had to decide is which Aramaic, Zohar's written in Aramaic, which Aramaic to use before then he struggles with the translation. So that,
And I add that he also said that when you do something like that in the 20th or 21st century in Aramaic, you get stuck because the vocabulary is not easily found like Hebrew, which everybody else at least can interpret stuff. He described the challenge of Aramaic in his project. I just thought that.
And then you understand that this is really a 13th century author trying to make it sound like a 2nd century author. So other than that, it's quite a challenge. And I will say I have lots of observations here. I am relying very, very heavily on this book, Kushner's book, called The Book of Job, When Bad Things Happen to a Good Person. If someone ever makes me head of a college or something, I'm just putting everybody on alert. If you come back to these slides, you will kick me out, because I haven't always tried to rephrase what Kushner is saying. So I am hereby declaring that he says things beautifully, and I don't necessarily change them around. So the poem of Job raises important questions, but doesn't necessarily answer them. So are people rewarded for good deeds? Does God care what kind of person I am? Is it okay to be angry with God, to doubt God's existence, and still be a religious person, and still be a good Jew? The poem of Job completely leaves the fable behind. This is super important. There is no mention of Satan or the wager or anything relating to that. This Job is not meek and accepting. God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of God. What he says to his wife, shall we accept only good from God, but not evil? As you will see, this Job is nothing like the Job of chapters 1 and 2, not weak, but really, really angry with God. And also, we just read the last few verses from the book, the happily ever after ending. It doesn't make any reference to Satan and the bet. So Satan and the bet seem to be just left hanging. There's some structure to be aware of, and one of the reasons why we won't read the entire thing, because there's actually, the cycle gets repetitive. So Job's 3 friends come to visit him. We saw the introduction to that they show up and, they spend 7 days observing Shiva with him, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And then Job responds after the 3 friends speak. And then there's a second cycle with a similar back and forth, but the tempers are growing shorter and flaring. And I'm going to try and just give you some examples of that. And the third cycle, there's more confusion and interruption. And then there's another person, Elihu, who just seems to show up. But throughout this poem, Job challenges God's fairness and kindness, and the 3 friends defend God. Let's see if I have anything else. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to get now into the logic, a little bit of, moving toward the answer to this question of theodicy. So I often talk about this, and I now, influenced by both Harold Kushner and other rabbis. So according to logic, in these statements in the first bullet here, only 2 of the following can be true. God is all powerful. God is completely good, and evil and tragedy exists. Namely, bad things happen to good people. If God really is in charge of everything and completely good, then evil and tragedy shouldn't exist. Job's story confronts us with the idea that God is all powerful, God is completely good, but we know that Job is a good person who is suffering. Job's friends will insist on number 3 being false, that Job is not good, that Job, the fact that he's suffering is, I guess what the lawyers would call prima facie evidence that Job must have sinned. Therefore, he should repent and move on. Job insists on 2 being false, by the way. Job, as we will see over and over again, will doubt the justice and the goodness of God. He absolutely agrees that Job, we'll see over and over again, that God is all powerful, but he doubts God's goodness. And Kushner and me will insist that number 1 is not necessarily true, that God is not all powerful. Bryce.
Yeah, so one of the things that that really comes through here is that this idea that God can be all powerful and yet is somehow running the universe, and it really can't be true. But what's interesting is people's reactions. When something bad happens, it's just almost universal through our cultures. When something bad happens to a person that believes in a God, they believe that someone has done something wrong. Something has been done wrong. And even if you don't know what it is, you still think, I must have done something wrong.
So
And
what
the point of this is that you didn't necessarily do anything wrong at all.
Yeah. So what I would say is that is a simplistic view of God, which many people have, because many people don't spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. So,
Of course.
and I would say, to the credit of the redactors of the Bible, they include this book in there to make us raise those questions that we raised in the previous slide. Alan.
I'm going to look at number 1 and say it's still true based on the premise of what I was impressed with, what we learned from your rabbi friend at Par, the Orthodox rabbi who helped us understand this very difficult thing about what God had in mind, which takes away the simplicity of true and false. Because this other dimension that, if I'm remembering what you said a little bit earlier, it still lets number 1 be true. Because God deliberately created an environment, and therefore God's power still there. Yeah.
So what? And I'll get into this at the very end of the class. Does God have micromanagement control over everything?
No, free will.
Well, there is free will, but what about a kid getting cancer? What about the earthquake? What about tsunamis?
That's your rabbi. We'll get her name sometime.
Yeah, I've got to find it.
It's okay, but see, this is so valuable to me because those questions can fit into her.
What I would say is where she will come out is there are things that we're just not going to understand, and ultimately, I think that's where the Book of Job comes out. Kushner gets a little more clarity than I would say the Book of Job has. And so I appreciate Kushner's clarity. Bryce.
I think number 2 and number 3 can both be false at the same time. This idea that God is completely good. How could a completely good entity punish and attack a completely innocent man that he knows to be innocent,
right,
on a bet? And the second thing is that, to me, it appears to be self-evident that if God acts in the world, then no one's volition has any meaning.
Yes.
Okay. None of your decisions. So I think I'm with Kushner and with Job.
Well, no, you're okay. So you're denying both 1 and 2. By the
Yes.
way, you could say there's no God, in which case there's no problem. In which case it's all physics and it's all biology and tectonic
That's not one of the
plates.
choices.
No, it's not one of the choices here. But what I'm saying is only 2 can be true, but none of them might be true. And if none of them are true, then there's nothing to discuss. It's just crap happens, deal with it. And of course, then the other question is going to be raised as Kushner's conclusion is God is not all powerful. So then there's a question of who needs God or what good is God. And of course, Kushner has written a book of that exact title. I think we're now ready. Okay. So about the argument, which is going to take, 38 chapters, Job's friends come to comfort him, but Job is not looking for vindication, but Job is trying to make sense of the tragedy that has happened to him. And it's worth noting that in this argument, unlike many arguments, you all have other screens at home. And if you consult one of those screens, you will see people arguing with each other. And unlike those arguments, in this argument, people are actually listening to each other and responding to what is said. And we will start next week. It's just about 8 o'clock. So we will start with chapter 3. And again, we're not going to read it line by line, and we'll go a little more quickly. But just to give you a flavor, the first verse says, afterward, Job began to speak and cursed the day of his birth. So for those of you who believe that Job is endlessly patient, you know exactly how patient Job was. 2 chapters. I'll just stop sharing so you can see each other. 38 chapters, 38 years. Did I skip? Oh, no, I've never heard that. Alan raises the question. And I actually don't even know when the chapters were put in. I think that's fairly late. I don't know in the different books. It may even be the Masoretes. I really don't know the answer about who separated the chapters because I don't think they're in the original. Okay, but a good question. Any other questions or thoughts? And hearing none, I will thank you for coming, and we'll start to dig into the text next time, and we will skip around. We'll read a bunch of it carefully in the beginning, and then to me the most intimidating part of teaching this is knowing where to skip. For those of us who love text, the idea of skipping and jumping around is anathema. But I'm being heavily guided again by Harold Kushner, because this is not a thick book. Okay, so he clearly is also skipping around and selectively quoting texts that make good points, and so I am very much following his lead in going through it. But if you want to read the entire book, you all have one on your bookshelves. I know this. So thank you all for coming, and
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you for a good
Thank
class.
you, Rabbi.
okay, we'll see
Thanks,
you
Rabbi.
Bye.
Night, Rabbi.
everyone.
next
Thank
time.
you.
Night, night.
Good
Okay,
night.
take care. Stay warm, stay dry.
You too.
Avoid whatever weather threats happen to be pummeling you.